So many people live their life practicing to get affirmation, not to get improvement. Which one, over a long period of time, do you think will achieve greatness faster? One that's doing it for affirmation of a boss, a parent, a coach, or someone else, a peer, or whomever it is, or someone that is doing it to be better?
Measure your progress and use that to motivate you as a strategy.
And most people start with action, but they never really develop the habit because they don't practice.
Welcome back. We're glad you returned for episode 8, that means 8, Reed, of ReedFlections podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I'm Art Calderon. I'll be steering us through conversations today with Reed Nyffeler right here to my right. If this is your first time joining us, Reed is a husband and father. He shares his time, talent, and treasure with communities and really all over the world. CEO of a global franchising firm headquartered right here in the heartland of America. Has a lot of personal and professional experiences that he's going to share with us to help us learn to live a life on purpose. Now, episodes 1 through 4, we talked about priorities, Reed. We talked about priority number 1, faith in God. Number 2, family. Number 3, productivity, work. And finally, enjoyment and rest. Now, we're going to talk about developing productive habits to go with all of that we talked about already. And we want to focus on priorities and how to pursue our purpose. Our last episode, we were talking about taking action, not just words, but actually putting those words into actions, taking that first step. Now, today is practice diligently. Talk about practicing diligently and moving on to excellence. What is something that you practice a lot and what motivated you?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we have to understand this challenge of taking a step from an action to then making progress on it. I mean, what do they say that, 95% of New Year's resolutions are done the first month? So basically, people have an intention, they make a commitment, a New Year's resolution, they take action that first day, then they quit. And that's because they didn't practice diligence. And they didn't do it diligently. And so,
That's my problem. Okay.
that's right. You're
I'm gonna
not
remember
practicing
that.
diligently.
I'm going
And
to
so-
watch this podcast.
That's right. Well, might be a good use of your time. So one of the things that I recognized was I wanted to improve as a speaker. And in previous podcasts, we talked about how, even as I'm asking my wife, I was like, I was not a great communicator, right? And so at the time, and still probably my favorite speaker ever was Ziglar. And so he was an iconic speaker and had written a series of books and just had a Southern twang and just way of positioning things and great storyteller and all these other things. So there's just a series of things that were there. And so I think first, if we're going to practice diligently, we should have an outcome or a goal or a result that we're looking for. And in my case, that was Zig Ziglar. I thought, here's a guy that's really funny. Here's a guy that could communicate clearly. He had a very broad audience. He had a huge following. And he was somebody that, I could clearly engage with, and he had tons of content, and each of his stories were engaging and different and relevant. And so I thought there's so many things in the way he communicates. That's kind of the piece. So if we're practicing, practice towards a goal. We take that first action, we practice towards that goal and outcome. And so then, as I did further research on Zig Ziglar, I realized that he didn't wake up that way. It wasn't that he woke up and he's this eloquent speaker that could tell all these great stories and everything else. In fact, that wasn't his first speech I was hearing. When he was already here, he was in his 70s, 75, 80 probably at the time when I was listening to him. And he had done it for years. And there was this interview that he had conducted that talked about, well, how did you become such a great speaker? And I thought, this is actually what I need to listen to.
Yeah.
Because many times we listen to people at their peak performance and we think they woke up that way.
Right.
And we say, I wasn't born with it. And Zig was born with it. He was born to be an eloquent speaker.
Yeah.
Nope. He said, I was a terrible speaker. And he talks about how he had become a kind of a salesperson at the beginning. He took action. He wanted to get commission. He was basically broke, and he had never had any money. And so he had to go out and work, right? He was motivated to go work. And so he went out and he picked a commission sales job, the only one he could really get, which was, I think, selling door to door. And he went, and the first year was terrible. And he sat down with his manager, and his manager said, this is it, dude. You're either going to produce or you're not.
Yeah.
And he said, He said he gave him kind of feedback and said, this is part of coaching and practice, is getting feedback on to improve performance, but you did not practice your ability to communicate. And so then what Zig said, okay, now I've isolated the incident, right? And part of practice is saying, what do I specifically want to work on that is holding me back from the goal I want to achieve? And so in the case of sales, communication and ultimately having this ability to communicate was a challenge. And so then he's like, well, what do I do? And he's like, I'm going to practice. And so his practice was multifaceted. He would practice in front of a mirror. Every day, he would go and practice, and he would change his voice inflection, he would change his engagement, he would change the questions that were being asked. Then he would say, I'd find an audience that wasn't sales. And so then he volunteered to communicate in front of the Boy Scouts, in front of these other groups, and he'd communicate messages that weren't sales. So he practiced his speech that was specific to his role. He practiced his ability to communicate that wasn't there. And then he started talking to strangers.
Wow.
So then he's on the bus as he's commuting back and forth, or he's in front of somebody else as he's there, and he practiced communicating. And so here he practiced in multiple facets. He practiced the content and job. So let's apply this to work. If we are in work and we're only practicing our job the 8 hours we're at work, do you think we really get better? Not necessarily. But if we practice outside of that, so I saw that, I got that from Zig. And then how did I improve my practice? I thought, you know what? I need to improve in a communicator. So I looked at my life and I said, okay, what are my priorities? Faith, family, productivity, and then, ultimately relaxation. And so where can I practice? And so, okay, in order to accomplish all our priorities, sometimes we can bring them together. So I had become newly married, and Dana and I got married, and I said, okay, I'm going to church on a regular basis. So where can I practice my ability to communicate? And I started a Sunday school class, actually. And so I said, okay, I can have a small group of a handful of people where I create content on a regular basis. I interact with them. And ultimately, that's how we met originally, was you attended it 15, 20 years later. But I thought, this is an environment where it's volunteer-based. Trust me, they're always short of people willing to serve.
No one's going to fire you.
Well, and if they did, I'd go find another place to, interject my commentary. And so I started a class. And so then I would practice. And I'd say, okay, well, that joke didn't hit. Or that one really did again. I got to tell it twice. And Dana's like, got to find some new jokes. So I practiced my material. I studied content, right? In this case, I was studying the Bible and pulling content, which is what I do in a work context, right? I research content and deliver it. Then I had a broad audience. I had people that, were working audience, people that had studied the scripture in depth before. And so I had to interact with different levels of audience, people that had just first Sunday school class I've ever been to. Newlyweds, people that have been married longer than I had been married, and all these other things. And so it gave me an environment to practice that. And so I could see that my skills were enhanced in a small group setting as a result, because that's the group that was there. And so that was an example of how I developed my skills in practice. And so then each and every week I'd prepare in advance, because it was every week, and I think, okay, what did I work on? And I do self-evaluation. This is an important part of practice. What went well the previous week and what didn't go well? And so that's practicing with diligence. Just like Zig Ziglar said, I need to work on talking to strangers, meeting new people. So on the bus, he's talking to strangers, right? So what went well with that interaction with a stranger and what didn't? Adjust. And that's practicing with diligence. And so I would do the same on Sunday mornings. I'd say, okay, this did or didn't work. I need a greater understanding of this information and an adjustment. I need to ask more questions and engage the audience more. And those became and developed and started the process of habits. And so that is what practice is for. You're building habits through routine. And most people start with action, but they never really develop the habit because they don't practice. They just expect to show up the next time and use their talent at the moment to perform. And they don't realize why they can't become the next Zig Ziglar, because they don't practice with diligence. And so in that case, I would evaluate, I would give myself opportunities to practice. I would evaluate my performance and then enhance that in my next practice.
Yeah, that's amazing. I remember as a young man, I enrolled in a college, small NAIA college out in Southern California, and I wanted to play basketball. Now, I had never played organized basketball before, but I figured, how hard can it be? You put the ball in the hoop, Turns out, very hard, very hard. The first day of practice was horrible because I didn't know the fundamentals. I didn't realize how hard these guys had worked to actually get to where they were now. And we had a meeting at the beginning of the season, I remember, with all the team, and the coach said, write your goals down, And all these guys said, well, I want to have 20 rebounds per game. I want to have 20 points per game. I want to have all these stats. And my goal was, I want to make the team. I want to start a game. That was my goal. By the end of the season, we had so many discipline problems and academic probation problems. We were down to 5 people. And the last 2 games, guess who started? Me, the least talented guy on the team starting. It was exhausting. I was out there dying. Coach, can we take a 20-second timeout? I didn't realize how hard it was, but it was a lot of fun. But what that taught me was it's not as easy as it looks. Talent is not enough. You have to be diligent and practice and get out there. And I went out there and I practiced as hard as I could every time we were out there. No one could outwork me on that playing floor.
That sounds like the selection process for a co-host. There was the last person available. Everybody else was on academic probation, and here you are. So, I mean, this seems to be repeated for you, and you practiced well at.
You did some sports in
Yeah, of
high
course,
school,
yeah.
didn't you?
Yeah,
Now,
and
tell us about what you learned
For sure.
about sports and diligence.
Yeah, and in all seriousness, I mean, practice in that environment is, hey, you're committed. So practice. I mean, you're on the team. You decided that's your goal. Do it, and it's not going to be easy, right? It's going to be difficult.
I was the only one who actually made my goals.
Yeah. Well, hey, there you go. That's true. The rest didn't even make it to
were
school.
kicked off the
That's right.
team.
Yeah. Good point. Set your goals as a manageable, reasonable goal. And I think sometimes, though, and to the point on the goal setting, because I think that's where the practice starts, is sometimes we make that goal too far reaching, we get discouraged, and so we stop practicing, and or we can't stick with it all the way through. And so I'll follow that basketball analogy, and one of the people that probably is undersized, and actually I will even say has revolutionized the game, is Steph Curry.
Yeah.
And so Steph Curry, if you follow his career, and I like to study deeply and broadly, not just look at their MVPs, but Steph Curry went to a small school, not a notable Big Ten school or any other big Power 5 conference. And he wasn't heavily recruited, even though his dad, Del Curry, was in the NBA, and he's following his track record, and he would go and get diligent coaching.
He got the pedigree,
but he was undersized, very lean, and everything else. And so then he said, the only way I'm going to get better is with practice. And in fact, if you go to games now, there's people that literally get there early to the Golden State Warrior games to watch his preparation for the game and his practice.
I've seen those clips.
And they're just watching him practice in this complete diligence. He's practicing his ball handling. He's practicing his shooting where he's going to do that. Because then in the game, it becomes routine. In the game, that habit is fully developed. He doesn't need to think about what he's doing. It's so natural because he's practiced so thoroughly. And, I was recently reading a book, and it talked about the time that took it to the next level. And so he was already a solid performer, but he hadn't won his championships yet, his 4 championships, and gone to the finals. And he wanted to say, I'm a starter already, and I'm a good shooter, but how do I take it to the next level? And so then he met this coach, and this is where practice and coaching can really come hand in hand. And maybe you're the leader in your coaching, and maybe you're the person that is practicing and you need a coach. And so in his case, this guy said, hey, I can make you better. And this guy said, well, how are you going to make it? Steph's like, how can you make me better? And he said, I'm going to break down every simple thing that you do and then tie it back to a time in the game that's there. And so he first did an analysis of capabilities. And so he said, okay, I'm not going to make you any taller, right? Steph Curry, is one of the least likely to dunk in the NBA. So he's not going to be more athletic that he can go dunk. But I'm going to lean into your strengths. You're super quick, right? You've got a quick release, and you have a great shot. Now, the problem with that is people are going to guard you. They're going to come all over. So how do you get away? That's what we're going to work on. We're going to work on ball handling. And so he said, one thing that you can leverage those skills is ball handling. And if you look, he's dramatically improved, and that's part of his warm-up, is all about ball handling. And if you look at him, he is actually using his ball handling to get open to take that three-point shot with a quick release. And so he is studying through hours and hours and hours of practice of all the steps he can do and how that then takes the defender off their defensive game so he can get open to take a quick shot.
And, we could say probably somewhere in America, there's some kid that was more talented than him, but didn't have that diligence, right?
That's right. He practiced diligently. So what is his practice? Look at his routine. And it literally is every single game. Just literally turn on the game tonight, watch the pregame, and he's doing that same exact practice, even though he's a 4-time, because this practice happened before he's a champion, by the way, but it didn't stop when he was.
Yeah.
And so many people feel like, I don't need to practice anymore. I've arrived.
Yeah.
Go look.
I don't need to improve anymore. I've already done it.
He's a 4-time champion, multi-MVP, one of the best, changed the game. Now you see people shooting further and further back. He's the shot and made the most 3-pointers in NBA history.
Yeah.
But that's all because he did that in practice. And he's 100% confident with his shot because he's known he made it countless times in practice. And that is the power of practicing diligently. And so, I can't say that I had the same prolific athletic career as Steph
I don't
Curry.
remember seeing you on the NBA or
And I'm a little more humble than that. I don't want to get my name emblazoned everywhere
yeah,
and be the
yeah, yeah.
MVP.
They
So I
were
leave that to
calling.
the other people,
You
right?
had to turn them down. I
But I will
understand.
say that I recognized the value of practice when I
Uh-huh.
was in athletics.
Uh-huh.
I remember my sophomore year in high school, I was a wrestler and I had an even record. And I said, if I'm going to commit to something, I need to, back to previous things, make sure that I can be at my best. And that's going to require more practice because that's the only thing I can do is put more time and effort into it. So I remember waking up and I said, if anybody wants to wake up, I'm going to be there every morning. I commit and then I take actions at 6 a.m. running. And so I would start, I focused on a couple of things that I knew that were things I could develop. One was my endurance. I knew that the wrestling match was 6 minutes,
Mhm.
and the majority of the time, whomever had the most endurance at the end could, overpower the individual at the end. So I worked on endurance. The second thing I worked on was strength, and then I worked on technique naturally because I needed a partner to be able to do that. But I could work on my own on endurance and strength. And it's just like breaking down the Steph Curry thing. He worked on his dribbling and his shooting range
Mhm.
because he needed a defender for the other side, but he could do all these moves without a defender there. So we break that down saying, what do I need an audience for? And what do I need? Just like Zig Ziglar, he could work on meeting strangers on the bus. And so in that case, I said, okay, I'm going to work on my endurance at 6 a.m. I'm going to go run, and I would run for an hour. And trust me, I hate running,
An hour.
but it was
long.
important to work on my endurance.
Yeah.
And then I would do weightlifting. And that's something I could do outside of practice. Then I would be able to focus on my technique in
Mhm.
practice. And so that was the way to do that. And then that year, I went from an even record to being a state runner up. And so, and then in fact, the state champion that I ended up beating, I had beaten him the week before, and it was a technique issue that I lost in the end because he had seen a weakness in my technique and
Right.
capitalized on that in the
Used
finals.
his
And so
own diligence,
he
huh?
used his own diligence. It was coaching, actually.
Yeah.
His coach had provided that. And so that was information. In fact, after that match, I distinctly remember my coach coming up to me, back to the coaching component. He said, that was a coaching failure, Reed. Because
Oh, wow.
he said, and I remember my coach saying at the time, he said, I was there the week before and I had confidence that you would beat him and I didn't coach you. And the other coach adjusted because he lost.
Huh.
And to me, that's the power of practice again. We think that what practice we're doing before, the week before I beat him, is going to be enough this week. No, Steph Curry still, today, Zig Ziglar, if he were alive, would still be improving his speaking abilities and communicating.
It's not easy to do that, right?
Mhm.
Let's not pretend like, wow, just be diligent and get up at 6 a.m. and practice your speaking and meet with strangers and so forth. So, say a little bit about strategies for practicing the things you do best when you just don't feel like it.
Right. And so, kind of again going back to priorities, there's one thing that I was a coach, and so I'll kind of pivot to that side of it. And so, I enjoy sports as relaxation, and we can talk about that. And my fourth priority, my top priority is faith,
Mm-hmm.
and my second priority is family. And so, when I'm outside of my productive environment of work, I had chosen to coach my kids in basketball. And so for probably 12 seasons, I coached Upward Basketball,
Mm-hmm.
which Upward Basketball is a faith-based basketball coaching. And I would always start with my kids as kindergartners. And so this is the first time any of them
That's
are
a
on a
lot of
team.
fun.
And I can imagine a young Art Calderon right there, similar to your college place where you don't even know what a basket is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you're dribbling it off your foot and you
Uh-huh.
may not be able to catch. So visualize that ultimately. But what I would always start with is I knew that in any coaching environment, in any practice environment, the most important thing is actually confidence to do it, the work, not success.
Uh-huh.
It's confidence. And so that first practice, without fail, every time, I would go and I'd hand the ball to maybe 2 or 3 kids that had never played before, and they'd be like this, shooting the ball.
Looking at you.
Right, because what are they doing? And so many times we
Uh-huh.
practice for the sake of affirmation, not
Yeah.
for improvement.
Yeah.
So many people live their life practicing to get affirmation, not to get improvement.
Mm.
And so a coaching technique, I said, and this is a coaching technique for you right today, is don't practice for affirmation. Don't do it to say, great, you came to practice. I can't wait for you to do that. You're doing great. You need this. No, you do it for improvement because affirmation will fade.
Yeah.
Whatever you do for anyone today will not be good enough tomorrow.
And it's inconsistent.
It's inconsistent.
Right? Some people think it's great. Some people know. Sometimes people don't feel like giving you the affirmation you may
Right.
deserve. Yeah. Okay.
So I talk my kids or my mom, I'm just doing my homework for you. Right? Boss, I'm just doing this job because you asked me to.
Uh-huh.
Or I want to be a better employee. So I'm doing this because I want to be better than I was yesterday. Which one over a long period of time do you think will achieve greatness faster? One that's doing it for affirmation of a boss, a parent, a coach, or someone else, a peer, or whomever it is, or someone that is doing it to be better? So the first step is don't do it for affirmation. So those kindergartners are standing there and they're shooting the ball and they're looking for affirmation. They're looking, coach,
They're shooting and looking at you?
And looking at me. And they're saying if they miss, they're, because why? As fans, another coaching technique. Do we give affirmation when they make the shot or when they follow through on the practice, right? And I recognized as a coach, I am going to affirm, because they're going to respond to affirmation. I can't change that, to good practice, not to a made shot.
So you tell them, hey, good follow through, regardless of whether they made
That's
it or
right.
not.
So as an example, we'll build on that analogy. I would teach them to aim for the square.
Okay.
And I didn't care if you made it or not.
Yeah.
I cared that you were focused on that square on the backboard and you hit the corner I was telling you to. Now, of course, I know as a coach, it's likely to go in if you do that. Now, that doesn't mean they made it every time.
So you would celebrate. You hit the square.
You hit the square. You threw it up there. And in some kids' cases, they would just kind of wait. They dance around. They wouldn't even throw the ball. So I'd have to start to say, you let it go. You let the ball go. I know they're not going to
even more fundamental.
Yeah, like even more fundamental. It's no longer in your hand, because I knew that if it was in their hand, it was going to be a shot they made, right? And so I was coaching progress.
Right.
And so we do not want to coach perfection. We want to coach progress. And so as a coach in practice, we are looking at what is the next thing for progress. So back to your basketball thing. Progress was, hey, Art, you can get the ball in the hole, right? Your coach is saying, let's just get Art progress. A great coach is not coaching perfection. They're coaching progress. And so maybe on the one side, we're a coach. We should look at those people we're leading and say, I'm here to coach progress. So let's do an assessment as to what yesterday's game was. And I always adjusted practice based upon the performance in the game and what they needed to work on. And we coach progress. And so the same thing in our own case. So I would wake up each and every day in areas I needed to improve. And I'd say, okay, how was I performing yesterday? What is an area that I needed progress? Because it wasn't going to be perfect, right? So it could be conditioning, back to my wrestling analogy, that, hey, I was able to run, 3 miles in that hour. So what is progress? 3.1 miles. I'm never going to make a 4-minute mile. That's perfection or whatever. I'm not going to be the world's
an
Olympian by any means. But what's progress? And so then I'd say, okay, what would be a step towards progress? And so one of the things that I would always measure, and it's quantifiable, but when I was early in my career, I had the whole state of Nebraska and half of South Dakota at an early job. And so one of the things it required was driving. And so I drove 70,000 miles a year.
70,000?
70,000 across the state of Nebraska. And, it is all cornfields. People were asking, is it all cornfields and cows? Yes, it is. Just so you know, I've driven it all and every mile there, right? It's, there's a couple of cities, but not many know it's all cornfield and cows. At least it was in the 90s when I was driving Nebraska. But one of the things I realized is, okay, how can I cut the other time down? Now there is a speed limit. Not that I always obeyed it, but there was one. So I couldn't change that. But what I could change was my brakes. I could say, okay, how could I be more efficient? And so what I looked at is if I'm driving that many hours and it's 70,000 miles, and let's say your car gets 350 miles a gallon or maybe 300 miles, you're filling up every, 3 times every 1,000 miles. Well, I would drive about 800 miles a day probably. I mean, just to get those miles when I'm driving easily on certain days, if not 1,000 in some cases, right? Because, you're like that 80 miles, a lot of it's interstate. So you're driving 10, 12 hours in some cases. And so I say, well, it's only going to extend my trip if I spend an hour at lunch. And so I had gotten it down to getting, and I wish I was joking, 12-ounce drink. Then I would have the refueling coincide with lunch. And I would go put my credit card in, start the pump, and then I would already know what I was going to get in the convenience store, which is a prepackaged sandwich with a 12-ounce drink.
Yummy.
And I could purchase it and be back in the car by the time that fuel had filled the tank.
Oh, wow.
Right? So I had made it essentially a pit stop in Formula One, right? I mean, I'm basically practicing my NASCAR. And that's what they do, right? I mean, if you look at NASCAR, the winner or loser is typically done on that pit stop. And what are they looking at? Every single action. And so progress for me in that scenario and in everything is what is efficiency? And so as we get to subsequent podcasts, we're going to talk about how even I have gotten to the point where the words I choose are more efficient to create impact than saying it in a longer duration. And we'll work our way down to that. But that's part of practice, is saying, okay, if going back to my scenario of leading a class, My timeline had not changed, but the information over that period of time that I could share could have greater impact. So if I'm there for 45 minutes and if I'm doing a 45-minute keynote, what elements can I choose and how can I say those words that can transform more lives, right? That's my aspiration as a leader, in a shorter amount of time. And then you begin to see pause. You begin to see repeating words, voice inflection, and you're really breaking it down. So I'd practice all those elements as I continue to develop as a speaker, as an area that I consistently practiced, just as Zig Ziglar had.
Outstanding. Well, I think the big takeaway there, at least for me, was don't do it for the affirmation. Don't do it for the affirmation,
No.
but find ways to measure your progress and use that to motivate
Right.
you as a strategy. Excellent. Well, once again, we're wrapping up here. Thanks again to Reed for reminding us about ways to develop habits today and sharing more about the importance of diligent practice to achieving our goals and accomplishing our purpose. Thank you, listeners, for joining us on ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. Next time, we're going to talk about perseverance. We're going to hit all roadblocks in the journey to achieving goals and to improving, and we need ways to navigate them. Until then, I'm Art Calderon. Get out there and be purposeful.
The majority of the audience, last word for you, Art. You're likely here focused, and I'm going to leave you hanging. You're likely here focused on affirmation of others. You want to appeal to the audience to get Instagram likes. You want to go have your boss see what you're doing and give you affirmation and an award. You want your parents to be proud of what you're doing. All of that is holding you back from your true progress because you will not please everyone, no matter what. I'll be the first to tell you there will be someone that is not going to aspire to your affirmation, and you will pivot your activities to them, and then you will lose progress as soon as you're in a linear. So focus on progress. And don't worry whether they appreciate it or not. There are even individuals that are at the highest level of performance have people that do not believe in them, but that does not stop their progress. So today, decide that what others think of you will not be the driving force of your practice or daily activity and aspiration for progress. Once you've made that decision, I guarantee you, you'll start making progress because you'll look at your life differently and say, how can I be a better version of myself? Not how can I please more people with my actions? So practice being a better version of yourself, and we will see you next episode.